All right, everybody, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's talk by Professor Dan Slater of the University of Michigan. On behalf of both of the two talk series, the Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Economy series here in the Government Department that Kathy Boone and I are convening this year, and also the Sauce-Wee-Hock Southeast Asia Center that's had a string of events this week, of which this is the fourth and the straightest. So we are glad to have all of you here and to have a whole bunch of people joining us online. Let me say a few things. If you are joining us online, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. So we will check in and see, put your questions in the chat, or if you want to express them yourself, we might be able to manage that. If you want to post about this event on social media, please be sure to tag the Southeast Asia Center in particular. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, and on YouTube, where you'll be able to find this because it is being recorded. So since it's being recorded, everyone should behave yourselves and try and look your best. And I should mention, in terms of the Sauce-Wee-Hock Southeast Asia Center, we have two events next week. On Monday, Sana Jaffrey, who's I think at the ANU now, used to be at the International Crisis Group, and before that, the World Bank. Impunity from Below, Vigilantism in the State and Democratic Indonesia on Monday. And then on Wednesday, Peter Zinnemann from University of California, Berkeley, talking about Huy Duk and the rise and fall of renovation in Vietnam, the final events we have this week. And both the Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Economy series and the Southeast Asia Center will have a whole string of events next term. But in the meantime, it's a real pleasure to welcome back to the LSE, former visiting professor here, perhaps again, Dan Slater, who is the James Orrin Murfin Professor of Political Science, the director of the Center for Emerging Democracy at the University of Michigan. He's a specialist in the politics of democracy and authoritarianism, especially in Southeast Asia, and has succeeded more than anyone in sort of bringing Southeast Asia into broader debates in terms of comparative politics on these and other issues. And his two big books to date include Ordering Power, Contentious Politics and Authoritarian Leviathan in Southeast Asia, published by Cambridge in 2010, and more recently, From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia, published by Princeton in 2022 with Joseph Wong. He's working on another book that extends beyond Southeast Asia to countries we won't hear about today. But he's here to talk about dynasties, or as they say here, dynasties, oligarchies, cartels, barriers to democratic competition in Southeast Asia. Over to you, Dan. Please welcome Dave.
Thank you. Looking for an amazing couple of weeks of some speakers you got. You should definitely come see Sana and Peter. And if this talk disappoints, don't let that dissuade you from coming to the next one. They'll be fantastic. And I have to say, so as someone who runs the center, I find it incredibly hard to get people to come to in-person events anymore. So I'm really, really gratified that you all came out, especially so late in the semester, and especially because I was walking over, it's been dark for like 5 hours by now. It's basically midnight, and as I'm walking over, there's all these groups of revelers out, like drinking with sort of under. And it's like, well, the competition is rather if anyone comes to my talk instead of being out having a pint with their mates, I'll be even more gratified. So it's really, really nice that you're all here. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually it's a collective project. The exact contribution to which I'll be making is still somewhat unclear, but it kind of came out of an idea that Aries Aragai and I had about a year ago. We were just sort of talking Southeast Asian politics, and we sort of came to our minds that like when we think about capitalism, we think about, well, supposedly capitalism is characterized by basically by free competition. Like there should be some kind of competition, but we know anyone who studies capitalism knows, but there are barriers, right? Nobody really thinks there's free competition, right? But yet with democracy, we sort of think, well, democracy, competitive elections, free and fair, and then if it's not that, it's authoritarian. Because well, aren't there sort of just kind of chronic barriers to competition in democracies that might in some ways parallel what exists under capitalism? And if a cartel arises, for instance, in in some sector, in some market. We don't think capitalism has ended. We don't think, oh, it's not capitalism anymore. You just think, well, it's just some kind of barrier, and that's just part of how capitalism works. There are these, again, endemic, intrinsic, barriers to competition that are part of how it works. But we say democracy, this word democracy, and then either it, something bad happens and it erodes or backslides, we now say, or you can, obviously, if you completely wipe out competition, then you've got authoritarianism. So we have concepts for that, but it just sort of, struck us that, some of these things actually have parallels. If there's, you have oligopolies, you have cartels, you have some kind of like dynastic grip over firms such that there's not much competition in these sectors. So actually, there maybe are some interesting parallels. So we started thinking about doing, getting people together for a conference, just thinking about these barriers to competition. To democratic competition in Southeast Asia, and particularly what we're interested in is dynasties and cartels, or different kinds of elite collusion. I added oligarchies just because I think, money politics is just such an obvious addition to think about in terms of like what's a major barrier to competition is just the price of of entry just into politics for as candidates and those unevennesses. So that's not part of the project yet, but I thought I'd put it on the table for our broader conversation. And so, so Aries, and then Napon, who's at ISIS in Singapore. So the three of us we've pitched this special issue, which they are going to review. So Journal of Contemporary Asia is going to review this. We did a mini conference in Singapore this past summer. And so started getting these together. So at this point, we've got a couple of papers on Thailand. So Duncan McCargo's got a piece on the elite collusion part, and then Napon and Projak have a piece that's on both dynasties and elite collusion. Aries, along with Joyce Bulau, has a piece on dynasties and elite collusion. Yos Kanawas has a piece on Indonesia, but specifically on dynastic politics in Indonesia. On Malaysia, Trisha Yeo has got a piece mostly on elite collusion, talks a little bit about dynasties, but less so. And then on Cambodia, Mark Vong Mun Vong has a piece on kind of the dynastic transition in Cambodia, which is a bit of the odd case out in some ways. So this is sort of where we're at in terms of accumulating these things. This is just a little bit of a, keep your eyes peeled for this to come together as we try to puzzle this through. And so I'll at a minimum, I'll help write the intro, probably with Aries and Napon, but I might also do a piece kind of an Indonesian comparative perspective. And so as I talk through, I'll kind of tell you what I'm sort of switching over to some of these ideas for what might be the individual piece that comes out of it. So it's a bit of an unorthodox thing to present to you. It's sort of it's a research agenda in a sense, but hopefully that gives us plenty to chew on, and it's obviously quite open in terms of what we do. So I want to sort of say we want to start with this theoretical intervention and an empirical intervention. Which is specific to Southeast Asia in a way. So the theoretical intervention, again, is that there are these persistent barriers to competition in democracy. And this is better theorized, I think, in the study of capitalism than in democracy. So barriers to market competition, we know all about, we study them. They're an intrinsic feature of capitalism, but these persistent barriers to competition in democracy that don't actually undo democracy, certainly to electoral competition, I think are not as well theorized. So when you have these things, dynasties, these oligarchies, cartels under capitalism, they don't undo capitalism. They mar it. They keep it from the kind of perfect competition that is supposed to be the ideal of how it operates, but it's still capitalism. And in the same way, these are still democracies, right? It's not just when regimes become outright authoritarian or experience these bouts of democratic backsliding that we see these barriers to competition emerge. So in a way, this is what Aries and I were talking about. Like, what's the democratic equivalent of market failure? Again, some sort of just chronic, consistent, problem of competition that doesn't raise the point like, oh, this suddenly there was some executive assault, or suddenly something happened, or you've had a coup d'etat, or these things that are quite obvious and well theorized and well understood, just sort of destruction of competition, right? And then I think the question that we're sort of, and this is really kind of the wide open question, is can we sort of compare these chronic barriers? So both in the sense of like, how do dynasties, oligarchies, cartels, how do they interact with each other in these cases? Is there a sort of natural harmony among them? Do cases with one tend to have all of them? Do they have similar logics? Because again, they're all features of capitalism as well as democracy. are these things we can think of some common logics across the divide between democracy and capitalism as well. So that's very, I told John, this is kind of a quarter baked idea, it's not half baked. So this part is really, it's maybe an eighth baked, but it's really just sort of something we've been puzzling over. And so we've gotten these papers and we'll try to put them together. So, but this is sort of the theoretical intervention or maybe theoretical launching point in a way. And then the empirical intervention coming at this from as a Southeast Asianist is about the fact that right now I would argue that the region has sort of puzzlingly low polarization. Okay, one of the biggest stories of the past decade, decade and a half is democratic erosion, democratic backsliding. Why? One of the kind of the mothers of all causes is polarization. So we have urban-rural, driven polarization. We have polarization over identity issues related to immigration. We have we have polarization driven by social media effects and the sort of the different ways that we're kind of siloed into these different communication, these echo chambers, and so polarization seems to be happening kind of all over the place, and it seems to have these global, almost technological causes, right? So it seems like no place seems totally immune. But in Southeast Asia right now, and there, as I will try to stress, there are some serious, woes to democracy where democracy even exists in Southeast Asia, but they're mostly unrelated, I'm going to argue, to polarization. And particularly in these four cases I'm going to focus on today, so Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, that in all of them, there have been pretty substantial efforts, particularly recently, to overcome polarization, or in the face of polarization, to forge new kinds of elite cooperation, often across very, very, kind of deep ideological and historical divides, which are limited polarization, but are damaging democracy in other ways. And this is a very old and familiar story in Indonesia, but it's a newer phenomenon in these other cases. So just to take a moment and talk about each of these four briefly. So in Thailand, you're probably familiar with, for the past, 20 years or so, the main story of Thai politics is this sort of back and forth and this kind of polarized pendular mobilization between yellow shirts and red shirts, yellow shirts in support of the monarchy and the military, the red shirts in support of Thaksin Shinawatra. Thaksin gets toppled in a coup in 2006. And so it's been 20 years of this back and forth, but this has been this kind of chronic, dividing line in Thai politics. But within the last few years, what's happened, because another party has arisen called Move Forward, that basically the military said we can deal now with Thaksin and with Putai, with his party, and basically Putai was invited to form a government in coalition with these old guard forces. So again, these are Putai and the military are supposedly these diametrically opposite forces, and yet they were brought into government together. Now, that power sharing deal is going poorly. So Thaksin's daughter was the prime minister and has been ousted over this scandal related to a leaked phone call with the leader of Cambodia over the border conflict there. So again, this is something where it's interesting that this was even sort of attempted. There is this, and in fact, I would say now, Putai's and Thaksin's popularity is so low in the wake of all this that arguably they've kind of, I think, at least potentially kind of wiped out this, and in a very authoritarian way, but they've wiped out this kind of polarization that's been going on for a couple of decades in Thai politics. So that's the Thai story. In Malaysia as well, I think Malaysia, at a societal level is probably, I would say, the most polarized. That you certainly have a very, very steep ideological divide over basically the proper place of Islam and of religion and of Malay ethnicity versus sort of multi-ethnic visions of the nation in politics. But despite that, we now have a coalition in Malaysia which links the Barisan Nasional, the old ruling coalition, with the Pakatan Harapan, the opposition coalition, which challenged it since the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. And in particular, in this coalition, you have these two sort of implacable rivals whose raison d'etre really is in some ways to oppose each other, which is, the old ruling party, the real champion of ethnic Malay hegemony, and the DAP, which is a predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly ethnic Chinese party, which has always sort of pushed for a more quote unquote Malaysian Malaysia, in which Malay ethnicity is not like a first order, first class citizen category. So we have this power sharing deal there now where the Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Zahid Hamidi from UMNO. So these two kind of opposite parties, but these guys have a very, very long track record together. They go back to their ties together in ABIN, the Muslim youth movement in Malaysia, back to at least like the early 1970s. So there's this, but the fact that these two parties are in coalition together is, again, a real change from, so despite the kind of polarization at a societal level, you have this government arrangement, which is working against that. And then in the Philippines, which is in some ways the most entertaining of going off of these, in terms of what the elite power sharing deals looks like. So the Philippines, where really dynastic politics has historically been the main kind of consistent, barrier to competition, if you will, or to kind of free entry into politics, which Sean has written really, really like extensively and brilliantly about. In the Philippines recently, what we had in the last election was this attempt by these two main families in politics, the Marcos family and the Duterte family, to come to a kind of some sort of rapprochement and basically a power sharing deal in which Bongbong Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos's son, would take the presidency. Rodrigo Duterte, outgoing president, his daughter Sarah Duterte would take the vice presidency. And pretty clearly the understanding was my turn, then your turn, and there would be some kind of rotation. This pretty quickly blew up. And this was part of, again, this conversation with Aries, where I said, there's no way this is going to work. Like, this is not the way the Philippines works. Like, there's too much factionalism. Like, family politics is just too strong of a force. I just think there's no way this is going to actually work. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I think that is, the historical roots of that. So at this point, at least, this is Aries' term, a dynastic cartel. So trying to build this cartel of dynasties. That would sort of put a kind of closure on competitive politics. And even before that, I would stress, when Duterte was in office, when the father Duterte was in office, there really was not much political opposition. I mean, basically, the political elite sort of rallied behind him, was willing to go along. So even in that context, too, I don't think I've used the word populism, right? But and I think it's a pretty lousy concept in a lot of ways, but Duterte is often seen as a populist, but he was not a polarizing populist, right? He was one who sort of strongman figure who could gather most of the political elite behind him. So again, are there problems of democratic performance? Is there democratic backsliding, erosion? Absolutely. Is it driven by the same kind of polarization and those dynamics we see around most of the world? I would say mostly not. And then in Indonesia, there was a pretty brief and serious episode of polarization over religious issues in the mid 2010s. And the presidential campaigns in 2014 and 2019 kind of mobilized around those issues. So there was this bout of, it seemed like polarization could become this real threat to democracy there. But there's a longer history in Indonesia of power sharing and this building of party cartels across these ideological lines. And that has come back with an absolute vengeance since 2024. In particular with now there's essentially a power sharing deal between outgoing President Joko Widodo, who endorsed his erstwhile rival, Prabowo Subianto. Prabowo is now president. Prabowo picked Jokowi's son to be his vice president. So there's a lot of children of outgoing chief executives becoming vice presidents of countries going on here, right? I don't think we have a category for in comparative politics or political science. But it seems to be happening. So it seems to be, again, this sort of theme in the region where, contra these cases around the world where polarization seems out of control, and elites can't get along, and there's this sort of constant war of elite against elite, and they're mobilizing people behind them, then in Southeast Asia, things seem to be mushing together a bit more. Not necessarily successfully, and these are cooperative deals that won't necessarily last, but the fact that they're being attempted, and in Indonesia, that it's really quite has really quite consolidated is, I think, of interest. So the way I'm sort of picturing this as a way of sort of setting up the special issues to say, let's just think about kind of outcomes arising from attempted elite cooperation in the region. Okay. And I would like to actually, in addition to the Cambodia paper, I'd like us to recruit a Myanmar paper. So people have ideas where you did have some attempts at elite cooperation across historically deeply divided, polarized, mutually like a lot of animus between different groups in both Cambodia and Myanmar. And in both of those cases, complete collapse. The absolute collapse of elite cooperation. And what that's led to is just a return to just really total autocratic closure in both places. Okay, so that's one way, that's one thing that can happen in a wake of an attempted sort of, again, elites historically with a lot of bad blood trying to cooperate. It can just completely explode. And that's the case both Cambodia and Myanmar. Then what I'm going to focus on more today, these other four cases. So again, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand.
I don't know whether to call this fledgling elite cooperation or failing elite cooperation. It certainly looks like it's failed in the Philippines. It's, it looks a lot like it's failed in Thailand. But I wouldn't write it off completely. I think it's certainly possible. I mean, there are real reasons why these elites tried to forge these kind of more cooperative deals. I mean, these are kind of armistices. They're a kind of peace agreement across the political elite in a way, right? So the fact that in the Philippines and Thailand right now they're not exactly active doesn't mean that they won't come back. So I think it'll be curious to see how those go. And then Malaysia is the one I would say that is sort of sticking the most. So that's the one where you do in fact have the government has lasted. It's struggling. There are all kinds of problems, but I wouldn't put Malaysia in the category of certainly not of a failed effort at building this kind of elite cooperation. So I'm sort of generally speaking regime uncertainty. I'd say in all three of these cases, there's certain things we kind of took for granted in recent decades about politics in these places just no longer true. And so there's a bit of drift or a bit of uncertainty. And then Indonesia for me is really the one case that stands out here as you've really got a really reconsolidated elite cartelization and basically kind of what you might call it like a collusive democracy in Indonesia, where historically political parties, the voters can propose, but elites dispose. People can vote, there's multiple parties, but once the elections are over, enough with the voters, let's all just share power however we want to. And it doesn't matter if you've lost, doesn't matter if you got a declining vote share. That really has almost no bearing whatsoever on what your position in government is going to be. Okay, so but Indonesia is very unusual in that way, and that's what I want to kind of get to here. So broadly speaking, this is something I called maybe whimsically or this Southeast Asia middle democracy trap. So just to give you a sense of these four cases and their trajectory over the last 20 years since 2004. And the main bouncer here, of course, is Thailand with its coups and then elections and another coup. But it's interesting how they're sort of converging here, right? They're all kind of in this, if one is, Norway, I guess, right? And zero is North Korea or something like that. These are all kind of in this sort of middle range here, right? And there's no dramatic story of erosion or backsliding. It's not like these are sort of, by whatever metrics, these incredibly high quality democracies that have come under some sort of dramatic assault or something like that. There's just sort of this ongoing kind of chronic problem. And this is not, by no means do I want to say that these issues of like ways of dealing with polarization are the cause of that. Some of them are pretty newly emergent. There's, I think, various reasons why this is the case. But I think at this point, at least, it gives you some sense of where these different systems are at. The fact they're all in kind of this similar ground where definitely no real breakthrough to a kind of deeper, more high quality democracy, but not necessarily, but not like Myanmar, Cambodia. If Myanmar, Cambodia are up here too, they're kind of more by the flat line, right? So there's real democratic life in these places, and ironically, once a little brief aside, what I argue in this East Asia Forum piece that I wrote about this middle democracy trap. So why is this? And so it sort of seems to me that the broader story here is one in which, as long as a regime is authoritarian, citizens, opposition will tend to care a lot about regime type. They get pretty focused on trying to democratize the place, right? And then after you democratize the place, it's a non-issue. And then everything is about cost of living, or everything is about public goods, and so these questions of political regime or justice or rule of law, these kind of fall by the wayside. So what you have in a lot of these cases is there's all this pressure against these regimes for and then once you democratize, then elites do totally fine. It basically takes people stop being anti-elite in the same kind of way. So the paradox of this is that Thailand is the one case that hasn't learned that lesson, because of these four places, the one place where democracy is still absolutely this galvanizing issue is Thailand. And the reason why is because the network monarchy or the Thai deep state, whatever you want to call it, that they have resisted, any kind of, really meaningful democratic breakthrough or like serious power sharing with civilian elites. So that's ironically, youth in Thailand are just really kind of amazingly still committed to and mobilized and voting in large numbers for progressive political parties in a way you're just not seeing that in the same way in Indonesia or Malaysia or the Philippines, in part because, well, now that you've actually gotten rid of this kind of old authoritarian system, like why is that still an issue anymore? So it really does, I think, reinforce the point of my most recent book, which is like, if these guys do what they're doing, just democratize the place. You're going to do completely fine. Like if you're an elite in one of these places, democracy does not go so badly for you. Like, and then you actually stop being a target. But anyway, that's sort of a little bit of an aside. So to me, there's kind of two big questions arising here from what I've been saying here. So one is this question: so why is polarization generally giving way to elite collusion in Southeast Asia? So all these four cases all at once. Like, why is this happening? I don't have at this point an answer for that. It's something I think we might sort of hint at in the special issue. I might try to tackle it in an essay, but at this point, I don't have a particular answer for that. But then for me, the thing I'm more motivated to dig into right now is, so why are, elite cartels in Indonesia so much more viable, it seems, than these other three? So I don't know if I think we might look back. It would not surprise me if you look back in a decade or so and say, oh, Thailand, Philippines, and Malaysia had these sort of attempts at these promiscuous power sharing deals, but they kind of failed to launch. They just failed to stick. We'll see. Whereas Indonesia absolutely stuck, and it has completely stuck. So why is that the case? And so let's dig into that a little bit. This is something I've written about a lot in the case of Indonesia. And this is a really, I think this is a propitious moment as a social scientist, because the frustration for me, or the difficulty for me, of trying to make sense of Indonesia, where essentially since democratization in 98, 99, you've almost consistently had these very, very, very oversized coalitions with little to no opposition, and the correspondence between what the cabinet looks like, what the government looks like, has very, very little correspondence to what elections look like, right? So there's just this way in which, and there's no sense of like a strong opposition, right? Which creates these problems for accountability. So I've been puzzling over this for, basically since it started in the early 2000s, but it's very hard to get, so people say, well, why is that? Like, why did this happen? And the difficulty is I just don't really know of many other cases where this happens, or really even gets attempted. It's such an unusual outcome. And so this gets at, like, to make a methodological point. So when people say, like, well, what's the limitation of single case studies in comparative politics? And the usual claim is, well, the limitation is they're not generalizable. Like, okay, well, this works in China, this works in Thailand, or this works in the Philippines, but it doesn't work anywhere else. Which I don't think is true at all. I think case studies tell us general things all the time. The problem with single case studies, the limitation is you don't know what doesn't matter. The problem is trying to figure out, like, everything seems to matter. So why does this happen? I come with 10 reasons why Indonesia has this sort of cartelized political system, right? But unless you have some negative cases, or cases that attempted to fail, it's very hard to know what matters and how much it matters. So now we actually have some other cases where there's at least in some minimal way some attempt to do something similar. So, like, okay, it gives me, I think, a new opportunity to think in a way I haven't really felt like I could before about, honestly, like, why has this happened? It's the biggest democratic experiment in the world of the post-Cold War period. It's a big, big case. Like, understanding what's happened in Indonesia is a big deal. And so the second line here, and my main argument here would be, this is like, I guess it's old-time religion. But for me, like, I go back to my first book and my first project, okay, and just think about, in Ordering Power, why did Indonesia have the kind of authoritarian regime it did from the 60s to the 90s? And basically my story about Indonesia was, it was very much a response. It was a counter-revolutionary regime built in response to these forms of contentious politics, particularly with the Indonesian Communist Party, but also with a series of regional rebellions, which led to a very, very broad-based elite authoritarian regime. So the elite in Indonesia was so totally, really, at least initially, behind this regime in a way that it created this context of pretty serious widespread elite cooperation in Indonesia for those 3 decades. And that creates certain networks, creates certain expectations, and just sort of sets the stage in certain ways for what has followed. Okay, so that, I think, is certainly part of the story, right? A second part of the story that I think is really important is, in just a really simple term, an institutionalist argument, which is what the rules were when democratic transition happened. Because when you had the first democratic elections in Indonesia in June 1999, after not having them since 1955, it was under this sort of unusual semi-presidential system in which people chose the parliament. People voted for their representatives in parliament. It was a closed list, so you just chose your party, and then the parliament would choose the president. So this sort of semi-presidential system. And that lent itself quite beautifully to political parties sort of coming together and deciding and ultimately anointing a president with a very, very small share of the popular vote, one of the smaller parties, but then and essentially inflicting on them kind of a cartel arrangement that they couldn't escape. So if there had just been straight presidential elections with no sort of two-stage process in 1999 Indonesia, it's not clear to me they could have pulled this off. It would have been much, much harder to. So to me, that's something that, again, it might have been necessary for this to happen. A third factor, which I'm thinking about now more, because now, as I'll get to, the fact that Malaysia, I'm really thinking, can this happen in Malaysia too? And that's really gotten me thinking about, there's some real comparative possibilities here, because Malaysia really, really had that, well, in some ways, again, a very, very broad-based elite authoritarian counter-revolutionary regime for many decades, right? And then one very big difference between Indonesia and Malaysia is what parliament looks like. So one thing people will say about Indonesia when they say, well, it's because there's no opposition because of how parliament works. Parliament basically works by consensus. They don't have majority votes. It's not Westminster. You don't have the opposition on one side and government on another side. Everyone's kind of comes together, and then they all everyone gets whatever their payoff is, or they get their concerns dealt with or not. And then just by consensus, this is approved. Everyone goes off back to their, very nice apartments in Jakarta. And so there's not this sort of consensus-seeking thing. I'd never thought, okay, maybe it has something to do with it, but it's very different from Malaysia. And I think that might be, so again, I would sort of focus on these three things jump out to me, these old authoritarian legacies, the institutional rules under which the cartel originally formed, and maybe something about the way that parliament works and the way that parliament doesn't take on and might be necessary for this kind of building a government versus opposition dynamic to politics. And one thing I'll throw in as an extra note here is, to the extent we're interested in how dynastic politics, cartelization, oligarchies interact with each other, and are they do they reinforce each other? An interesting paradox in Indonesia is that it's only probably the most famous political dynasty in the country, the Sukarno dynasty, right? So Sukarno's daughter, Megawati Sukarno Putri, we talk political dynasty, right? But she has ironically been the biggest barrier, the biggest obstacle to building a full party cartel in Indonesia, because she's been the one who now, I guess 3-4 occasions, has said, no, we're going to stay out. And the PDIP repeatedly has stayed out of these otherwise completely encompassing cartel arrangements, right? And so in some ways, possibly there might be interesting ways in which dynastic politics doesn't lend itself to cooperation in certain ways. That could also be, interesting thing about the Myanmar case, right? So the fact that the NLD, the main opposition party in Myanmar, so totally dominated by Aung San Suu Kyi, by the daughter of the nation's founding father, has that made it impossible in a way? It made it even harder to come to some sort of deal between the military and the NLD, such that the military cannot deal with her. They just refuse to deal with her. If the NLD were more open, if it wasn't ruled by a particular dynastic figure, maybe it would have given more possibilities to the kind of cohabitation between civilians and military in Myanmar that happened from 2011 to 2021, maybe better prospects for it to stay. So I think there are interesting ways in which dynastic politics and collusive politics might either undermine or reinforce each other. So I want to wrap up with the sort of thoughts about Malaysia here. So where is Malaysia at? It's a much newer thing. But this again, this coalition arrangement between the Pakatan Harapan and the Barisan Nasional, it does appear to be sticking, at least for now. It's got it's basically defection proof. It's a pretty solid majority. So whereas the prior attempt in 2018 got undermined by some backdoor defections, like this one has got some solidity to it numerically, but it's extremely fragile. In a couple of senses. One is that it really does hinge. I don't think this could have happened without this one, 50+ year, relationship between these two politicians who go back to, this experience in the youth movement and then being in UMNO, both kicked out of UMNO in 1998. Zahid went back to UMNO, Anwar stayed out, but these guys have known each other absolutely forever. And basically they are the nucleus of this power sharing arrangement. Zahid being the leader of UMNO, Anwar being the leader of the PH coalition. And this was again, and one reason why people disgusted with this is because Zahid was facing just dozens and dozens of corruption charges, which basically got just wiped aside as soon as this deal got struck. So you can imagine why it's not the most, especially for the incredibly brave, energetic really heroic civil society movement in Malaysia that decade after decade sort of chipped away and finally managed to displace the BN from power, and have them just brought right back in and have this these corruption charges just thrown out is I think incredibly dispiriting. And I think there's a real sense of dispiritedness in Malaysian politics since this happened. It's also it's this really, I think, a very, very big structural problem that the coalition at its heart does include this one really implacable historical rivalry between, as I was talking about, between UMNO on the one hand, DAP on the other. I mean, really, like, what does it mean to be UMNO if you are, if you're breaking bread with DAP, which is committed to ending any notion of Malay privileged Malay preferences, right? What are you as UMNO if you're working with DAP when you know this is exactly what they're, you've spent, I mean, we're talking, since the, we're talking since at least the 60s, right? We're talking 50, 60 years of every single campaign being DAP, like they're the threat. They're trying to take away, they're trying to take away the sovereignty of the sultans. They're trying to all that. And so to be in a power sharing arrangement, and there already are these calls from at least some in UMNO to say, we have to get out of this arrangement. We just have to just dump this government. We can't keep, so there's already some calls. And there were just by-elections in Sabah, in East Malaysia, which basically, I mean, they sort of showed not a whole lot of popularity for either part of this ruling coalition. So the pressure, I think, so it's very unclear if and when this will last. And I think, again, just at the level of voters, I haven't seen the most recent sort of polling, maybe some people have, but again, my sense is that there's a real lack of acceptance of this. There's a real sense that this is a betrayal. And something that, although it might have been necessary, just even form a government, I do think there's a lot of cynicism, a lot of popular unhappiness about this, that in such a way that you can imagine it being, it's on weaker foundations, the Indonesian case, because I don't know if you watched, any sort of footage in the coverage of the Indonesian election, this last one, but people were in a great mood. It was like, this was like, people were very happy with Jokowi. They're very happy that Jokowi and Prabowo aren't fighting anymore. They're very happy that Jokowi managed to kind of hold on in some ways by putting his son in as vice president. I mean, this is like, as they say in Indonesia, a festival of democracy, right? So most places where some kind of strong man with a dark authoritarian past, like Prabowo, they come to power. I've read this, like they come in with a snarl, right? Like this is with a smile. So in Indonesia, there's not a sense that this is kind of some kind of enormous problem. Now, there are all kinds of problems of governance and non-responsiveness that I would say are a result of this cartelized arrangement, right? But that's not necessarily how people see it, right? So I think, again, people, it's a very, very different kind of popular level of support. And again, I think in Indonesia, after several decades, this is just how it works. Like how else would it work other than you have an election and people tend to, like they then, they go meet behind closed doors and they stop arguing like they did during the campaign, and that's just how things go. This is very much not what Malaysians are used to. And I think also in Malaysia, the fact it literally is like if you're in the Malaysian parliament, it's like being in Westminster. They face each other. It's government against opposition. There's this very, very natural day in, day out reinforcement of the divide between government and opposition, so if we think about, is this something that could spread? Is this something that even with the steep ideological divides and really fundamental disagreements about the place of Malay ethnicity, the place of Islam in the nation, could you overcome it? Because you've overcome it in Indonesia. I think there's something about that history of parliament, a parliament that takes on that form that might make it less likely in Malaysia than in Indonesia. So in terms of whether this could expand to more like a full-blown cartel arrangement. So just sort of sum up. So again, theoretically, there's these chronic barriers to competition in democracies, as in capitalism. What do we make of that? Second, there's this, I think right now, this moment of Southeast Asian exceptionalism, why we're seeing a series of these power sharing arrangements in the face of polarization that seem to be very elusive elsewhere. So what is it? Is there something about the region? And then this Indonesian exceptionalism. So why cartelization is consolidated as much as it has in Indonesia when it hasn't elsewhere. So those are sort of the things on my mind, and just it's a lot to put on the table, but be very curious for people's reactions to any parts of it. So great.
Many thanks for a super interesting talk. I'd like to open up for questions and some answers. But in the spirit of, sort of, in the spirit of sort of cartel-like control. I'd like to abuse my chair's privilege and just begin the discussion with a question and then a comment. So the question is, you discussed this, at least it seemed implicitly in terms of national level politics. And but there is a literature on sort of subnational politics in these countries. One of your authors, Prajat Works, wrote his thesis, at least on this in Thailand. And there's a literature also on subnational authoritarianism that sort of came and went, hybrid regimes. Wondering whether the analytical tools from that literature, the lessons from that literature, or the specific dynamics in these countries, or both, might help to illuminate the patterns you observe. And the second question or comment is this. So you began and sort of ended with reference to, democracy and capitalism in terms of an analogy.
Right.
But there are a lot of theorists who say that democracy is profoundly shaped by capitalism.
Yeah.
And in Southeast Asia, business and politics are very profoundly intertwined. And if you look at the developmental model, as people like Robert Wade here have described for Southeast Asia, what distinguishes the region compared to, say, East Asia is the extent to which you have export-oriented growth, and yet it's foreign capital that dominates the export sector, and the commanding heights of the domestic economy, the non-tradables, whether it's finance, real estate, construction, telecommunications, retail, consumption, et cetera, are dominated in cartel-like fashion by major diversified conglomerates that are politically connected and protected. And so I wonder if it's not just that there's an analogy, but that there's a causal link between the two. And then in terms of the exceptionalism that you find in Indonesia, whether that has something to do with not just the institutionalist kind of explanations you emphasized, but the sheer extent of the BUMN, the state-owned enterprises, and the kind of goodies that you get if you're inside the coalition. And that the sheer weight of that in terms of campaign resources and advantages of incumbency in a broadly coalitional sense.
Yes.
So do you want to respond to those?
I do. Those are such good questions. That's a lot. So if people will forgive me for taking a moment to answer. So on the Indonesian exceptionalism point, yes. So this is something that so the idea of state-owned enterprises, more of a natural resource driven economy in a lot of ways. And again, so being excluded from the coalition, being in opposition is more costly, right? Than in a place where that's less the case. And so I do think that's part of the picture. To me, the issue, so I guess there's the two shortcomings of that argument have always been, one, you have a lot of resource-rich economies which doesn't arise. And usually if there's a lot of stuff, that makes us fight more. It doesn't make us get along, right? And that although it might help explain people's desperation to be in, it doesn't explain these presidents' willingness to let them in. And so this question again, I don't. A theory of politics that says the more you have, the more you share, I think is probably not a theory of politics. That's going to work in most cases and in most places. But I do think it's part of the material foundation of it. So I completely agree. But again, it's like it doesn't get you to explanation. I like this idea about that's totally right. Capitalism and democracy are not just analogies; they are absolutely intertwined. I do think there are parallels between the way kind of these conglomerates, cartel kind of economies do work, and so I think that could maybe create sort of again some kind of condition of possibility for these things to arise. But again, you both have to understand, so suddenly the region has this mushrooming of a series of these, but it hasn't been the way things have worked historically. Right? So again, the Philippines and Thailand, where I argue totally different kinds of contentious politics back in the 50s and 60s led to much, much more fragmented elite coalitions, and we still see that elite fragmentation to this day. So I like the idea. And on subnational, that's totally right. In fact, the paper on the Philippines that Aries and Joyce wrote, exactly their point is that the Philippines is characterized by this kind of machine politics at the local level, and talking about why that doesn't translate to the national level. And so they're sort of, I don't want to speak for them in terms of their argument, but there is this attentiveness to that. And as you say, Project Link's interested with local politics. Malaysia, of course, is a federal system. The state level politics is hugely important So thinking about how we again, another kind of intertwining here, right?
Mhm.
Capitalism, democracy, subnational politics, national politics is really that's really important to put on the agenda. But it does seem it is interesting in Indonesia where these like whether or not these same kinds of coalitions exist at the local level or not. I think there's been a lot of shift in that, but more or less it seems like there's isomorphism that parties they're willing, and even the two parties that never worked together at the national level, PIP and PKS, at the local level they will when they need to. So
you have a whole bunch of hands that were raised and people in the queue. Do you want to take them one by one, or do you want to?
well,
Let's see how
I'll try
it.
to see if I can.
Okay, there's
Is it a
Robert.
chainsaw and a watermelon? Then
Okay, so Robert Wade, and then
Okay, so I wondered whether you or your colleagues have tried to apply this kind of perspective to not just Southeast Asia, to Northeast Asia, and to make the comparison. I'm thinking, for example, that Northeast Asia is the site of the notions, the theorizing of the developmental state, and it is striking that the Northeast Asian governments, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, have been much more consistent in implementing strategies of production diversification, production upgrading across many decades than has been the case in Southeast Asia. And one very good reason for that difference is because the Northeast Asian countries are not resource rich. The Southeast Asian countries are on the whole. And so that in itself would help to explain the difference. But just looking at the politics of the two regions, the Northeast Asian cases do seem not to have these characteristics of dynasties and cartels in anything like the same way that the Southeast Asian one comes. And then the question is, if that's the case, why is it the case, and to what extent does it relate to this point about resource rich or resource poor?
I like it. And I will answer this one. So I guess the one exception in Northeast Asia, so Japan, of course, has tremendous dynastic politics, right, on that one. So I mean, I didn't talk about dynasties. I'm just not that interested in dynasties to begin with. Like, and honestly, the money politics too, like that's just everywhere. I mean, I know there's variation, but like the rich dominate in democracy. I know, right? Like families tend to like I know. Like it's the cartel stuff, like this stuff is weird. Like this is really interesting, and it's so important in Indonesia. So with the Japan exception, I totally agree with you. And yeah, and I like this. I mean, I've argued this, you know, in my work on developmental state, that the resource differences is big. And I think that's, again, I think thinking this in terms of conditions of possibility is really helpful. At least in my mind right now. And this idea that there are conditions of possibility in political economies of Southeast Asia and not in Northeast Asia that make these kind of things more practical, more practical. That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
I've got 7 questions lined up, and then we might have we have 2 online. Can we proceed with some more in-house, in-room? So thank you.
Hi Dan, I'm Nick Kokoyapa. I'm an assistant professor in IR.
Nice to meet you.
I have a ton of questions. I will limit myself for sanity. But I'm quite struck and enamored by this, like bringing in the market concepts onto study democracy. We do it at the micro level, not the macro level. But then it got me thinking, right? You know, all the examples we were talking about with cartels, with oligopolies, in theory, our check is the state, right? The state does antitrust. And so what's like the equivalent version of that? I guess you would say civil society in some form, and maybe that's where the polarization story comes in, but I'm not sure where that goes. And similarly to John's question, right, we could go subnational or we could go international, right? Where a lot of oligopolies and cartels and markets today are not at the domestic level, but at the international level.
Yeah. And
I'm not sure how that would fit into, like, global capitalism can partly work because of domestic oligopolies, right? Whereas I'm not sure if there what the link between domestic democracy there and international democracy in your story would be. And very quick other comment. It sounds like for your, I don't know these cases anywhere closer to detail as anyone else in this room, but it sounds like you're using kind of like Winters' sultanistic oligarchy implicitly at times, right? For why we aren't getting cartel. And so, you know, I don't know.
Tamed oligarchy and wild oligarchy.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I think about oligarchy in pretty different ways than than Jeff does. But I'm gonna take those under if I can invite some more. Those are great. Thanks for the comments and questions.
I'm Tiffany. I'm a PhD student in the government department, one of John's many students. This is super exciting. I'm really looking forward to getting some vocabulary and theoretical tools to talk about Southeast Asian democracy beyond just democracy and autocracy. But maybe I might be picking on something that was more of a hook than a substantial part of your research. But you talked about polarization, and also you're framing this as sort of like barriers to competition. So I was wondering, like, to what extent do you think competition is a good thing? Because when you talked about polarization, I was like, well, I'm not sure that we want to see the kind of competition and polarization that we're seeing emerge in the West in Southeast Asia. So I mean, this might require some truly heroic normative judgments, say where you want to stop with regards to political competition. Because I mean, maybe you didn't mention it, but even thinking about the other referring to the regional level politics, like emergence of pattern Islamist policies and politics in Malaysia.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of wanted, like, what do you think about where we should stop? But you know, you can there's more questions.
Yeah, no, that's I'll just say briefly on that. I mean, I think this is something that it's important to recognize. I mean, in some ways, what this hope this project could do is maybe a slightly recuperative reading of polarization, right? Kind of a 2 cheers for polarization, right? In the sense that, you know, polarization at least sort of means, right, your democracy means something, you're competing over something. And so, you know, what I argue in this recent piece about Thailand is like, you know, populism in Thailand has been kind of a mess, but what defeated it is much worse. So I think that sweet spot, or what you will, where you're having some kind of healthy competition that doesn't become a kind of pernicious polarization, I think we have to use a balancing act rather than just, because I think out there in policy communities and even academic, there's this idea like, what can we do to reduce polarization? Anything that reduces polarization has got to be good. But well, you know, not a lot of things reduce polarization that are not good at all. So let's at least put the other side of the spectrum on here. You know, it's the less common syndrome.
Hi, Tuckman. I do formal theory in this department. So that neighbor talk. I guess I have two sets of questions, or two questions. Like, one is, I'm just curious, like, what is like your conception of capitalism and kind of like the introduction? Because my kind of like background in thinking is just like whether there's like private means of production or means of production privately owned. So it doesn't seem to me that like dynasties, oligarchies, or cartels are kind of like this at odds with capitalism as a kind of like as I was like, you know, as kind of like I felt, and kind of
For sure.
Yeah, but second set of questions is kind of more on the implications of having this kind of like dynastic or cartel-based politics.
Yeah.
And so the kind of like point of comparison being used here is polarization. And when people say that polarization is bad, there's usually two lines of attack. Either there's a normative reason in saying that violates like certain democratic ideals, which I assume is kind of where the oligarchic or cartel picture you're saying. And there's also like a consequentialist critique of like polarization, which dominates kind of like most of my, you know, my impression of what my empirical colleagues are up to. And is it the case that like the cartel set of kind of competition here in lieu of like ultra polarized politics is like normatively undesirable from a consequentialist point of view? If so, why? If not, why not?
Okay. I'm gonna think about that one. I guess I would maybe it was very quickly on the capitalism thing, and it's, you know, it's quarter baked, eighth baked. So I'm not I don't want to go to the math too much, but I do think, I mean, capitalism by definition, you have private means of production, but also something about exchange, right? And also something about that that there's some level of, you know, the possibility of market entry and these kinds of things. I think I think it's more than just the private means of production, but yes, that part of it. And yeah, I think as John whispered, he's like actually existing capitalism. That's exactly what I'm saying. Like, there's a way in which we know actually existing capitalism is not the capitalism of books, but for some reason we don't do the same thing with democracy. I don't think. I mean, we know there's problems, but we don't know how to talk about it in quite as easy of a way as we can with capitalism. I think that's my sort of, again, kind of my starting point here, which could be off.
Well, I think that's a nice way to ask what I was just going to ask you.
Okay,
Because,
okay.
whether there is reason to pause thinking of politics through that sort of market and economics lens, because if we think about politics as a process of aggregating or funneling preferences over how to wield power, and economics as a means to either allocate or produce resources in an economy, maybe we have always implicitly assumed that barriers to politics are a good thing. If you think about representative democracy, that's basically putting a barrier to every single person participating directly into how we wield power, right? Or electoral institutions as means through which we aggregate parties and present them as ways to put power in place. So we have always assumed that some form of aggregation or an institutional mechanism is actually a good thing to moderate politics from being constantly wild and anarchic, right? So I wonder whether applying that economic model of thinking about market failure there's limits to that. I'm just wondering. And second, I think what is really interesting here is that there's a pattern of elites bargaining themselves into quasi-authoritarian systems here, sort of divorcing themselves from what electoral politics is throwing up. I mean, this is sort of a reverse of how elite breakdowns happen in an authoritarian regime, right? So what have they now solved that they've bargained themselves back into that quasi-authoritarian setup? Like, did they find something that they couldn't do before in a prior era that now works again? Because these countries have been through that process. They had an elite bargain and that broke down. And then they had to go through democratization. Financial crisis accelerated some of that. So was this just a 20-year wilderness of those elites finding the way to put them back into power and sort of divorcing themselves from what electoral politics demanded of them? And then finally, only because I lived in Singapore for more than a decade, I think Singapore might be a good case here, right? So you have the Lee Kuan Yew family staying in power.
There's a dynasty.
And then there's also government-linked companies that they put into place. There's oligarchic power in the market. So I think a Singapore author might be a good one for here.
Well, one you might know about more that the institute where we hosted the one rule that I've ever gotten to ICS when you were in Singapore, but the one rule there is you do not talk about Singapore. Talk about Singaporean politics. Singapore is not in Southeast Asia as far as I was concerned. Everything else, Singapore is not even a case. So I think, it's but I think there might be some power in the strong hint.
Do we need to cut this out of the YouTube video?
No, definitely not. No, and I don't think it's something where it's much more of this kind of politics of control and of silencing essentially. It's not obviously authoritarian to say we're an institute that is focused on the external dimensions and so we just don't focus on Singapore. It's just not. There are other institutes that do that, but it obviously has, anytime questions of authoritarian politics come up, it has that most fortuitous effect for local powers that be. So on the dynasty part, for sure, and thank you. Good reminder.
We have 4 more questions here and 2 online. Okay, so let's soldier on with the questions in the room. Petra.
Yeah, thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I had a few sort of questions as well, and maybe I'm not going to throw all of them at you, but I kind of thought what John was saying about the kind of the merging or marrying of business and politics in Southeast Asia, across Southeast Asia, and I kind of wonder as well, because I mean, Thai case is the one that I am the most familiar with, but you have monopolies across the economic kind of sphere, and what is happening in kind of the political sphere right now is almost like the consolidation and merging of some of the monopolies. So it's not necessarily like that on the capitalist plane there would be something that's diametrically different to what is happening on that kind of political plane. That was one kind of potential thought, or just kind of thing to throw. And then I was also thinking about, and this perhaps more applicable to the Thai case, when you were talking about relatively kind of low levels of polarization, or polarization maybe being somewhat decreased. But I think when we look at the Thai case, especially following the sort of 2019 election, we have slight shift in the cleavages, whereas before it was red and yellow, now it's more the kind of progressive versus conservative politics. So I kind of wonder whether in some ways it's just a shifting of the cleavages that are defining the kind of polarizing conflict that we have seen there. And that in the Thai case, at least, has allowed or enabled that kind of collusion between the conservative and taxing forces, because they now have a common enemy that didn't exist before.
I think that is exactly right. And I think that when you think about both the Thai and Malaysian cases in particular, where I think that where these power sharing deals run against the grain of very strongly felt cleavages among the population, right? But this is exactly what I was saying about the idea that in Thailand there's still a regime cleavage, right? The other places there's not. In the past there have been. Again, you democratize, you get rid of the regime cleavage. And again, if you're an elite with some kind of authoritarian past, you cease being a problem. And so Prabowo could just be Prabowo, right? Because there's no regime cleavage anymore, right? And so I think that's totally right. And so I think one thing to think about here is how much, in thinking about this as, a region where polarization is in abeyance, right? There's one kind of version where I think you could say, I do think Indonesia is a place where it is just literally a much less polarized place than it was 10 years ago, like at the popular level for sure. Thailand and Malaysia, I think, and I think Philippines has been, since the 2000s, I think it hasn't really been all that much. And then it is around certain politicians. But I think there's something about both the Thai and Malaysian cases where you can say you can really, really identify a very, very important, like what people call like a formative rift in politics in a way, which is not resolved. And that's why this is sort of like a papering over, or so it's in some ways it's collusion amid polarization rather than collusion as something that defeats polarization.
I'm Denise van der Kamp, an associate professor at Oxford, and thank you, Dan. That's a really exciting framing, this idea of market failure in democratization or democracies. One of the questions I had though was, what is the role in the people of all of this in theorizing the barriers to change? Because in my single case comparative country, China, when you were talking about Indonesia, you said, the people, they have these power sharing arrangements and people just accept it. That's the way it is. That's the way it's been for decades. Well, in China, that's the way it's been for decades. And political scientists do not accept that outcome. They're constantly asking, why do people accept it? They're coming up with theories why. Whereas I'm not hearing that in you. And I'm wondering if it's just Southeast Asia wide people accept that that's the case. People are not part of the story. Or are we a bit lazy? When people are in autocracy, we care why they accept it. When they're in democracy, they have a voice. We don't care anymore. And I'm wondering if one of it is, it's the way people interact with cartels and oligarchies in the public imagination. Maybe it's replicated in the political economy. And so that's why they accept it so much more. Whereas if it's a monarchy or a dictatorship, then it becomes much more alien and unsafe.
Yeah. So this is very meta. Have political scientists accepted the idea that the people in place have accepted some kind of and I was probably too, I didn't want to seem too, cavalier when I talk about Indonesia. Indonesian civil society, and especially Indonesian youth, are absolutely phenomenal at opposing, policies and power grabs and all kinds of things that offend their sensibilities and strike them as unjust. Like absolutely, I think a la China, Indonesia is a revolutionary country, and there's a sense of the people's involvement in politics and their historic role, which is different from most of the region. Thailand, I think, is a case where they're fighting to create exactly that. To me, it's like there's just Thailand does not have popular sovereignty, in the sense that these other cases do, and that's what this is all about at basic level. So. I think that I definitely don't want to overstate acceptance of it. I do think there is, Indonesians have been pretty happy with the way the political system's been working, at least the electoral system, this kind of thing. And they were denied any kind of real electoral choice for a very long time. And I think they especially like local elections when there have been pushes because I think it was who was saying, is this just them getting their act together after 20 years of wilderness, right? That is absolutely how the Indonesian elite sees this. It's just sort of like, hey, finally, like we could, all this stuff that we had to do and local elections and these kind of things, like, trying to roll these things back as much as they can. They definitely want to. But when they start making noises, they would love to get rid of local elections. But if they try to get rid of local elections, they're going to absolutely have an explosion on their hands, right? I mean, even Jacoby, 80+%, when he floats the trial balloon, try to run for a third term? Absolutely not. I mean, it was just overwhelming. People were like, there's no way we're going to accept him doing a third term. So there are real limits, and Indonesians have a very strong voice in certain ways. But there's something about this way of Prabowo being tamed. He went from being this brutal old guy to being the cuddly grandpa. People feel seem to be pretty content with that. Which we can definitely study why they're okay with it or whatever. But,
Thanks. So I have two questions. The second of them actually follows really close to that last one. The first is, I was wondering if you could clarify more. I mean, there's a literature on party cartels and cartel parties, and I know you've drawn on that before, but I think the term is used pretty loosely here. And so in two ways. One is, like, I would not call Malaysia's agreement a cartel. It's a coalition, much like any European coalition. But so I'm wondering if you're talking about elite power sharing, elite agreements. There's a difference where parties are strong versus where parties are meaningless and wholly the creations of elites, as is often the case in Indonesia, except perhaps us at this point. So I'm wondering if maybe you could address that issue of where parties fit in, and what's the dividing line for you in this conceptualization between a coalition and a cartel? In Malaysia, there's still another vision of the polity, vision of governance, and so forth in a different coalition. The second question is, which is a little self-serving because it's something I've been trying to write on myself, so I'm hoping you might give me some, new inspiration here. This is also another way of understanding what's damaged or damaging about democracy in the region, is the extent to which politics, polarization, real privileges have been displaced from the electoral sphere to the street, to these mass protests in Indonesia and Timor-Leste, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, that is this. I mean, one could see this as this debate has happened, of course, in the Philippines with the rounds of EDSAs. Is this super democracy or is this anti-democratic? And it's politics, polarization, all of that outside the sphere of electoral contestation, which could reflect just deep disenfranchisement, a la in Thailand.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you are working on that, because I think that's a great way.
You're supposed to answer how I do that.
Unfortunately, I don't like the idea. So go is my main reaction. I love that. I think that is right, and I think that there's I always, there's this expression, one of these things, these hacking phrases in politics. People say, oh, well, people get the government they deserve, and I'm like, no, they do not. And I just feel like it's like in Southeast Asia, I feel like more than anywhere else, just like constantly, like when you look at what people strive for and what activists work for and fight for, and then you look at this political class, and they're just so overwhelming, just so dreadful compared to like what people's aspirations are. So I really like this idea that it's fair, that it is that kind of failure and that mismatch, and this way in which, even as kind of Petra's point, even as there's this felt thing at the societal level, the street level, if you will, that just totally doesn't get captured in party politics, electoral politics, that there's a deep disenfranchisement in that. So I'm gonna agree with your question, unfortunately, but I'm gonna keep thinking about it because it's great. I like your distinction between parties. So the Indonesian example are these sort of oligarchic parties in the Winters sense, which is just rich guys, like very, very rich people. So they create a political party. And that is really, then they've got, access to preserve, and they want to make sure that they're in the government. And that is really different from a PKS or a DAP or some of these parties that, or a Putai before, with real social roots. And the implications are pretty different when they join or not, which speaks to your question about, yes, cartel. So I was totally being loose on that for sure. What's happening in Malaysia is not a cartel. It is, as you say, it is a coalition. I do think it is what I call promiscuous power sharing, in the sense that it's, although it was in some ways, just necessary by the math. Like there really weren't a lot of options because you don't have, that many coalitions. So there are real differences between just pure coalitions versus, and I think actually, so Duncan McCargo's got a pretty new journal democracy piece, which he references in his piece here. But he calls them toxic alliances. And he's got here are these 7 features of toxic alliances, and here's why they all are them. I think those are pretty good. It's about, I won't be able to just sort of pull it out from my hat, but it's some of these things about that again, it's the kind of impossible bedfellows and the idea that these things are negotiated behind closed doors rather than being put to electoral tests, and pretty clearly being about what you're saying about excluding certain forces from politics. There's sort of these set of things that we actually can engage these things. Yeah, I don't think there's any choice that Onward didn't have a lot of choice this time around. I think what happened in 2018, I think, again, did you have to bring Mahathir in? Like, I don't think so. That's a longer debate. But it's in written form. I'll be much more careful to be and much less loose with that. So I appreciate you calling me out on that. That's totally fair.
Final in-house question.
Great, thanks, Dan. Super interesting. I like the analogy of the cartel, and I kind of buy it for some of the cases. Indonesia, maybe even coalition to Malaysia. There's sort of this supply side, bunch of construction companies with higher barriers to entry coming together to decide what they offer to voters.
Yeah.
I think there might be some more of a need of a mafia analogy for countries like Thailand and Myanmar, well, maybe with Cambodia as well. Because you have ways of dealing with construction companies that don't want to be in the cartel in those countries through an entrenched role by the military in Thailand and Myanmar and the courts as well in Thailand. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about sort of outside options, like if you're not going into this cartel, what happens then? And it seems that they vary systematically across countries. So I don't really know if that's a help to think about outside policies as well, or for your explanation.
Yeah, like whenever we're in power, one of the things that really struck me was there's this phrase, like in Malaysia, I would keep hearing people use this phrase like, oh, they're going to be in the political wilderness. Like they're going to be in the political wilderness. Like if they do this, they'll be in the political wilderness. And I was like, that's not what an interesting phrase. And I was like in the Philippines, there's no political wilderness, right? Because there's no managed forest or something like that, right? You can be out, you can find other networks, there's other ways. And this was kind of what the very heart of what ordered power meant, is like you create a domain of order such that everything outside is wilderness, right? And so that's where, again, I think that this is in the Indonesian case, they have, it's something that they've built a kind of order. Like is this sort of, democratically constituted in the sense that these people are all, elected and elections are fine. I mean, the last one had dodgy elements, but basically these are pretty free and fair elections. But they have created this kind of this abode, this darl, order, right? And outside there is this creation of wilderness, and I do think that's certainly not the case in the Philippines. I mean, Papa Duterte is in The Hague, and Sarah Duterte's been impeached or whatever, but they just absolutely, as far as they just crushed in the midterms, right? But like, is my money on the Dutertes or the Marcoses, 10 years from now? I don't know. Like are they in the wilderness? No. Like, because that's not how the Philippines works. So I think that's right. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think I'm hesitant to say that some of these deals and cooperative arrangements, like in Thailand and the Philippines, have failed, like in a as in they're over sense. This round it's not sticking. They haven't latched, but that doesn't mean folks are going to come back around again. Is the Thaksin family done? Like, no, I would say they're done, right? They're certainly on the back foot. They've lost a lot of their popular appeal again, but that's, they're not quite in any kind of wilderness in the same way.
We have two either bots or no, we have two real people out there who've been waiting patiently. So let me read the question for those of you who are struggling to read it from afar in the room. Eric White, independent scholar in, of all places, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I have a question about the Thai case and the failure of elite collusion. Interestingly, Thailand has a very robust and powerful literal dynasty, the Thai monarchy. How has the enduring power and legitimacy of this dynasty impacted the failure of elite collusion to effectively manage democratic competition?
Let's look at both.
Okay, and the second one is Manuel Guerque at the University of Pisa in Italy. Thank you for the great presentation. I'm curious about two elements and how they fit into your broader story. How do institutions that define the executive's control over the budget relative to the other groups in parliament affect elite cooperation in different countries? And how do narrower or broader corruption networks shape the ways political elites cooperate or fail to cooperate across countries?
This
Comparativist question.
I know, the first question seems like this might be to help his own research agenda, a la Meredith's question here, right? This is, so I think this might be something this person works on. It's just to find the executive control of the budget relative to other groups. And, so I guess kind of like overall like executive power. Yeah, I think this, it's a little bit like Aruna's question in a way about what these corruption networks actually look like. Yeah, and I don't want to say, I don't know if I used the word corruption during my talk or not. It wouldn't be what I stress. I mean, I think again, this is, are there government business relations for sure? This is, I'm not sure what's kind of driving this, if that's what I would necessarily say. Certainly Zahid was on, he was, up on corruption charges. I guess I used the phrase then. I guess there is more. There's more to it than that. I think that the reason people want to be part of these arrangements, in some cases, I think in the Indonesian case too, there's a genuine, like, people don't want to go back to what happened in the mid 2010s with, massive mobilization on religious grounds, right? There is some virtue in trying to make politics, to take the heat off in some ways, right? I don't want to say there's not that. There's just nothing but self-dealing and corruption. So I guess I think these are good questions, and I think they matter, but I also would say I wouldn't read these as, this is not mere reflections of, like, these are corrupt countries that have, and here's the corrupt democracy that goes with their corrupt economy, right? I think, especially coming from a place like the United States, which at this point is just like, it's just absolutely beyond, it's just beyond any fathoming the kind of like high level corruption that's happening now. This is, again, where you have capitalism, you have corruption. So, these things, it's part of it, but I don't want it to dominate the whole story, I guess. And then, the Thai monarchy. Big dynasty. And I guess I would say here that it's been something that, like, its existence, it's always given, so to the extent that the military kind of repeatedly feels some need to open up the process to allow some civilian involvement in politics, not kind of do these things on its own. It can always kind of run behind the skirt or the sarong of the monarch in a way, right? Like when they don't like what's if civilian politicians are getting too uppity or getting too that at the end of the day, they know they have an ally in the monarch and putting the civilians back in their place. So I think there's certainly a way in which, and for Thai, right? Again, it's a little bit like the Malaysian situation where you say, well, if you're the Pakatan Harapan, are you willing at this point to do whatever you can to make sure you've actually won this election, you can form a government after being in the wilderness for so long? For Thai, it's like you have a chance to actually form a government, right? Is that, again, you could say that it's a total betrayal and they're working with the military and these things, but also, sometimes the way you actually go from opposition to government and actually being able to govern is in these stepwise kinds of ways. So I think certainly the way the monarchy works in Thailand is a barrier to, it allows the military to give less space to these civilian parties than they would otherwise, for sure. Although, if you're counterfactual as Myanmar, where there's no monarchy, at least on occasions, has served as some kind of symbolic legitimating glue to help make these deals work. In Myanmar, it's just bone on bone, and it's just military on NLD, and just like one of the biggest catastrophes in the world right now, because there's just absolutely no sense of that kind of comrade, that ability to build any kind of elite cooperation. So again, that's why I want to say, as we position these things, like, yes, the Philippines might look like this gigantic mess or whatever, or Thailand is really kind of shocking for a move forward to be disenfranchised like this. And there are all these things to get kind of fired up about. But if you look at a place like Myanmar or Cambodia, you're in an absolute different league of political disaster. So let's not forget about those in the process.
On that note, we should draw things to a close.
Go to one of those drinking spots after that.
Thanks, Dan, for a super interesting talk. What sounds like a great journal issue and bigger project. And thank everyone for attending, and look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.